get you ready for next week's test. All right, the test is on 3 chapters. You can find a detailed lecture on each of these chapters by going to iCollege. But anyway, starting with chapter 9. Chapter 9 is about India, medieval India. Here's some things to remember about medieval India. Oh yeah, by the way, folk, be sure you see me. Now, you're all adults. I don't feel like I should have to hunt you down and say, hey, you missed pass 2, you missed test 2. If you've missed a test, check on, or if you don't know, check on iCollege. If you don't have a grade for a certain test, you need to see me about making it up. So make sure. Papers are due, and as of now, as of Saturday, when I checked 2 days ago, nobody had turned theirs in. The early turn in for 6 points is due on Wednesday. Test next week, chapters 9 and 11. All right, India. India was divided during most of this time period. For a time, Hinduism was a dominant religion. Then Buddhism threatened. But Buddhism did not take over India. Instead, Hinduism reformed. Now, folk, in your study of religions, every religion has, at one time or another, been threatened either by internal division, and no, there are no exceptions. They're either internally or by an external religion coming along that seems to offer more or be a little bit better. But for a while, Buddhism threatened Hinduism because Buddhism, it might have been, we don't know for sure, but it might have been because Buddhism was more egalitarian. But Hinduism reformed itself, and Hinduism then became the dominant religion of India permanently. Became the dominant religion permanently, but Buddhism was destined to spread from India here into Southeast Asia and become a very strong religion throughout what is today Vietnam, Myanmar, Cambodia, Indonesia, the Philippines, and make inroads into Korea, and a little bit into China and Japan. But Hinduism and Buddhism never took over China, never took over Japan, but became very strong here in Korea, and here in these islands that you see is mostly green on your map. Very strong. Buddhism might have become unpopular because it ran counter to India's caste system. India's caste system was just built into India's, you might say India's soul, or some people would say India's psyche or India's psychology. And Buddhism ran counter to that, and a lot of people did not like it for that reason. In India, they had a tradition of strong monarchy, but they seldom lived up to that tradition. Now, long about the year 1000 in India, about the time the Vikings were coming to the New World, India was beset by the onslaught of Islam. Which, you know, Islam had started with Muhammad and around the year 600. Well, 400 years later, Islam had spread throughout Persia and Afghanistan, and India was destined to be partially conquered by Islam. You know, the northern regions only. You know, what is today Pakistan right here, what is today Bangladesh, and what is today Nepal. These regions became under strong Islam influence. But Islam was never able to take on all of India. Now, when Islam first came into India, around the year 1000, they caught the people of India unprepared for a wave of foreign invaders. Well, also, Islam used horses. The Hindus used elephants. And it proved to be that the horse was a better battle weapon than the elephant. For one thing, the horse is faster. And also, if you're sitting on the back of an elephant, I mean, to me, I'd imagine being afraid to fall off. If you fall off an elephant, you're almost certainly dead. You can fall off a horse and survive it. But also, when you're faster than your enemy, if you don't want to give battle, you can always run. There's nothing wrong with running if you see you can't win. But when you're slower than your enemy, you have to give battle when he gives battle, whether you want to or not. So eventually, though, the people of India gave up on using elephants in battle and began using horses themselves. Something, though, that I think went on, your book doesn't mention, the terrain. The Islamic fighters were great when galloping into battle on horseback. But this kind of fighting does not work where there's a lot of vegetation, a lot of undergrowth, a lot of bushes, a lot of jungles. I mean, I just can't imagine those Islamic fighters fighting here in Vietnam, and maybe that's why Islam did not make much headway in Vietnam, because they could not conquer Vietnam by force, and the Vietnamese knew how to fight in the jungle. And of course, we Americans found out the hard way. They knew how to fight in the jungle because they've learned how for thousands of years. But when Islam started getting into the fertile part of India, the part of India where there's a lot of trees, a lot of bushes, a lot of vegetation, Islam did not do well. But really, the other thing that hurt Islam was long about the time Islam was getting started conquering India, the Mongolians came in, led by Genghis Khan. Genghis Khan forced the Islamic people to quit fighting him. I mean, they forced the Islamic people to quit fighting India and start fighting Genghis Khan. When Genghis Khan passed off the scene, Tamerlane, I'll call him Tamer the Lame, or Tamerlane, T-A-M-U-L-A-N-E, sometimes called Tamer the Lame. He claimed to be descended from Genghis Khan, but I don't know if this can be proven or not. Anyway, Tamerlane began fighting the Islamic people also. He built up an empire. During this time that Islam was being forced to fight the Mongolians, India built itself up and was able to, at that point, hold off further encroachment. So to this day, I'm talking about 2016, northern part of what was once India is now under the control of Islam, and that includes Pakistan, Bangladesh, and much of Nepal, not all of it. So 3 countries here in the north of India. But India proper, this region here, resisted Islam. The 2 groups did not always get along. And again, if you read the book or listen to my lecture I gave last Wednesday, you'll find some of the differences. But one difference I want to point out is that the Islamic people eat beef, Hindus do not. Neither one of them eats pork. But this created some friction. Also, Islam left intact a lot of India's customs without doing a lot to change a lot of India's customs. Well, time went on, and India and Islam went into a stalemate here where neither side could win. But then, in 1497, this is Portugal here, and of course it's logical that the Portuguese be first. The Portuguese sailed around Africa and landed in India. When the people of India first saw these Portuguese sailors, they were dirty, they were ragged, they were suffering from scurvy, a disease caused by lack of vitamin C, and scurvy would knock out all your teeth. We don't see that disease hardly anymore. But they were, again, the Indian people were not at all impressed with what they saw of the Europeans who arrived in the late 1400s. But by the end of the 1700s, India was conquered by Great Britain. Now, Portugal was too small to conquer India. Portugal was the first ones. But then the Portuguese were followed by the French, the Dutch, and the British, and to a lesser extent the Italians. What wound up happening, the Dutch got this region, the French got this region, the British got Hong Kong, the Spanish got the Philippines, and the British wound up with India. Now, I don't know how many of you know this, but Great Britain once had 13 colonies in North America here, and Georgia was one of the colonies. In the late 1700s, Great Britain lost its 13 colonies. Hopefully all of you heard that story.
That was at the beginning, right?
Well, that's not the beginning, but I mean, this is leaving ancient history a little bit, but I mean, Georgia was one of 13 colonies. You know, Georgia and South Carolina, North Carolina, and Virginia, you know, these were the 13 colonies. Well, in 1781, Britain lost them. So to save face, Britain went over, where the same army had just lost in North America, and they conquered India to try to get the big colony back. They could not reconquer the 13 colonies that they had lost. They realized that that would be impossible. We had too many people here who were willing to fight. So they conquered India, and that's jumping ahead of the story just a little bit though. And India was destined to be conquered by a European country, something that Islam could not do. But that's jumping ahead of the story a little bit. Now, leaving India for a time and going to Southeast Asia. Southeast Asia is a very diverse region, but because it's all scattered, I mean, look, there's about 1,000 islands here, folk. Yeah, 1,000 islands, that's the name of a salad dressing. Anyway, about 1,000 or so islands. In addition, the islands themselves are divided by steep, super steep mountain ranges, to where I don't even believe Alexander the Great could have conquered this region. Make a long story short, nobody ever conquered or united this whole region. If somebody could have, they were a diverse people, much like the United States became later, except the difference was the United States people spoke the same language, at least at one time we did. People in the United States spoke the same language and had very similar ideals. These people were different, diverse, like the American people, but they did not speak the same language, they did not have the same ideals, and they were separated by oceans and by mountains to where nobody ever conquered them. Nobody ever united them. These people were strongly influenced by India, and eventually most of these peoples here in Southeast Asia adopted the religion of Buddhism. Now, in the middle of a jungle, there was a city called Angkor Wat. Well, about 100 or so years ago, a European explorer was going through the jungle, and all of a sudden there was this clearing, and in the middle of this clearing was this magnificent, totally abandoned city. The buildings were still standing, and a lot of them were in a good state of repair. That big 6 foot long snake stood across his path. He left the snake alone, the snake left him alone. The tiger peeked out of a window and looked at him, but he left the tiger alone. This explorer went back and told other Europeans what he'd seen, and they went in and they began to wonder who built this city. I mean, this city, big city in the middle of the jungle. They finally learned it had been built by the people who today are the Cambodians. They had held it for a while. I mean, they had made a huge, monstrous city out of it. And then they had abandoned it because uncivilized people around them were threatening them. So they simply moved out and became uncivilized like the people that was about to conquer them. They adopted the ways of the people who was about to conquer them. They moved out and abandoned their city. Folk, this is another example of where civilized and uncivilized people meet. The uncivilized win. I told you in your syllabus to be looking for examples like this, and the reason I'm so concerned about it is right now the civilized world is facing a threat from people I would call uncivilized. And I fear unless we change our ways, the uncivilized people will win and take into the darkness of uncivilization again. If that sounds pessimistic, I'm not going to apologize for saying that. And all of you know who I'm talking about. Do you have a comment?
No, I said who.
Oh, who?
Yeah,
the terrorists.
Oh, okay.
Okay, they're terrorists, and all of you know what religion most of them are. These terrorists are on the march, on the move. And the problem with civilized people is after time they become too politically correct to do what has to be done. They become too soft and too weak. And the uncivilized are fighting by the old rules of ruthlessness. Basically, these terrorists are bringing 7th century morality into the 21st century and getting by with it because the 21st century people are too morally, politically correct to actually go in and do what has to be done. So they're going to win time and time again, and eventually, as far-fetched as it may sound, they could force the civilized people into uncivilization, which is what happened to Angkor Wat. The people of Angkor realized we can't stay in our city. Now, something else about Angkor, and again, this was in a National Geographic article I read about 30 years ago. That's when I first became aware of the existence of Angkor. When I was in school, folks, our teachers did not teach us the history of this part of the world. And I knew very little about it. But one of the problems that Angkor Wat had, their first kings were Hindu. But then the Hindu tradition fell by the wayside here in this part of the world. And they adopted Buddhism. Here was a problem with it. Hinduism made them energetic. Let's go out and conquer. Let's take responsibility. Buddhism said, accept what is. What will be, accept it. If there's adversity, don't try to change it. Accept the adversity. Buddhism made them passive. Now, again, if you're a Buddhist, I mean, that's what I read. Buddhism made them passive, accept what is. So their kings began to, when the enemy encroached upon them and their wealth was whittled away, their kings just thought, well, somehow we must accept this as being the will of heaven. They did not actively fight it, actively pursue it. The people whom they did not conquer wound up conquering them. And this was true of Roman history. This wound up being true of China's history. The people they did not conquer wound up conquering them. All right. Let's see. All right. Moving on. Chapter 10, Medieval China. China had a way of picking its government officials called the civil service exam. Civil service exam. What this meant was that if you had an education, you could take the exam, and if you made a high scoring exam, this would qualify you for a government position. Now, I had one student ask a question, how do you know that a high scoring exam would make you a good leader? You don't, but then again, what the purpose of the civil service exam was to make sure that a government position was not filled by an oldest son just because he was old. Like, for instance, the father might be a government official. Well, when the father died, who was going to take his place? And they would try to make sure that it would be someone who was mentally competent and not someone who was just simply was not mentally capable or qualified. So the exam did a lot to promote some kind of equality, but they weren't completely equal. The civil service exam meant that only the rich could take the exam because, for the most part, the poor were not educated and not learning how to read. Now, there were a few exceptions. Sometimes a rich man would spot what he thought was an exceptionally bright young poor child and educate him. So a few poor people did move up, where some parents were able to figure out a way to get their child, their son that is, educated. Only men could take the exams. Also, the exams became slanted to where you had to memorize large portions of Confucius's writings in order to pass exams. Basically, they became slanted where only Confucian people could pass them. This was to guarantee that Taoist and Hindu and Buddhist people did not do well on the exams. Now, it's been more than 10 years ago that I said this out loud. And a student from my class ran up to the department head and reported me. If you want to report me, go ahead. My present department head has said I can say what I want to. I'll say this. In the United States today, our exams, particularly the national teacher exam and the graduate record exams, the really high up exam they need to take you into graduate school, are slanted toward the left.
does that mean?
Huh?
What does that mean?
Say again.
What does that mean?
All right, that means you have to be a socialistic, liberal, or semi-communist in order to do well. Slanted towards that only the liberals do well. And basically, the higher universities help you go into the university system, the more you discriminate. And also, I mean, I will tell you on a personal note, this is something I seldom do, but the tests at the big university for history are mostly essay. You write an essay. Let's face it, folks, when a teacher sees an essay test, that teacher can put any grade they want to on that test. And when I was in grad school, we were suspicious that they were showing favoritism towards certain kinds of students, most notably leftists, liberals, socialists, communists. We suspected it. We could never quite prove it. The Chinese definitely deliberately slanted their tests towards a certain doctrine, towards Confucianism. Now this is that much is in the book. What I threw in about the modern time, that's not in the book, obviously, but it is easily noticeable that our universities are slanted strongly towards liberalism and leftism. Eventually, I mean, China, like India, had debates about religion. Eventually, Confucianism was partially replaced by Neo-Confucianism. About the time I was your age, you people today, this term neo became really popular. There was a neo grammar that lets you, where there were new rules of grammar that came in for a while, and neo this religion, neo that philosophy. Well, the Chinese experienced what they called Neo-Confucianism, and Neo-Confucianism almost took over, became the dominant religion of China for a while. But eventually, mainstream Confucianism did some modifications and pulled the Chinese people back in, and Neo-Confucianism fell by the wayside. Now, several of the Neo-Confucian philosophers were executed for their beliefs. Among them, a man named Yang Wangming. I believe that he might be, let's see, anyway, there's Yang Wangming. He was executed. Then after, what they would do, after they'd execute him, they would make a really popular hero out of him. And this was true of more than one of their philosophers during the period. Their philosophers would debate issues about moral standards, but one of them, I believe it was Yang Wangming, said that people exist between two worlds, the material world on the one hand, and the spiritual world on the other, and we are in between. And we have to decide, choose which is going to be the dominant factor in our life, the spiritual or the material. If we choose material, that means we'll fall into a life of greed and corruption. If we choose the spiritual, that means we'll fall into a life of honor. They did not look for a happy afterlife. All the reward they were going to get was in this life. And Yang Wangming said this about his ancestors. I honor my ancestors not because I expect to see them again, not because they exist. I mean, he believed once they had died, they were gone and there would never be an afterlife. He said, I honor them because I feel like I should honor them. And in turn, my descendants will honor me when I'm gone. Because mankind ought to remember where he came from. So he would honor his ancestors, but not because he was looking forward to a happy afterlife with them. Eventually, like I say, standard Confucianism wound up triumphing. These attempts by the philosophers were attempts to explain the universe and explain man's place in it, which is what mankind has done throughout much of history. Now, what you'll find on your test at least, I'll tell you there's at least one question, maybe two. What was the difference between China on one hand and Europe on the other? The main difference, folks, was a mindset. Your Chinese philosophers were more interested in contemplation and figuring out the, you might say, man's place in the universe, while Europeans, philosophers are more interested in practical. How can we make a better mechanical clock? And again, it was Europeans who invented the mechanical clock, and this is important because the mechanical clock was to lead to the inventions, ultimately, of the automobile and airplane. Now, if you know anything at all about a mechanical clock, they have gears, and the gears are set to a 60-to-1 ratio. 60 seconds to a minute, and then 60 minutes to an hour. And of course, the hour hand is set to a 12-to-1 ratio. If you've ever tried, and I have, to make a gear to where all the teeth will fit, and then put another one so all the teeth will fit, oh, it's difficult. The Europeans did, the Chinese did not. Again, the Europeans, you might say, are more mechanically minded. The Chinese more philosophically minded. Some people said the Chinese philosophers were too much interested in were too heavenly minded to be of any earthly good, even though they did not always believe in a heaven. Nevertheless, their philosophy contained a lot of what we might call metaphysics, whereas Europeans, spiritual though the European mind was, it had a very practical side to it also. Make a long story short, the Chinese were far ahead of Europeans up until about the year 1500, even up to the year 1700 or 1800. But then in the year 1800 or so, the Chinese began to fall far, far behind. The Chinese had invented a lot of things that should have put them on top. They invented gunpowder. They invented a movable sail. And if you know anything about sailing vessels, you cannot sail a ship across an ocean without just being able to move the sails to accommodate the wind. They invented the rudder, again, necessary to guide a ship. They invented the printing press. They invented banking. They invented paper money. And folks, without banks, you cannot put out things like airplanes or locomotives or have big businesses like railroad business or steel mills, or you simply, I mean, you have to have banks to have a smooth flow of money in order to do this. But eventually the philosophers came in and told their employers, hey, these banks make people greedy. We can't have greed in our country. You must close them down. The Chinese built large ships that are known to have gone to Africa, and one of them even brought back a bunch of giraffes, which the emperor was impressed with. The Chinese thought that you must let these ships rot. They're destroying us. They were afraid of was running into people whose life was different from theirs, and that they would have to change. And folks, this is what mankind has been afraid of all through the ages. What if you meet a people who have more on the ball than you do? They're a threat to your way of life. They're a threat to your religion, your philosophies. And this is one of the reasons that the Islamic people are beginning to blow themselves up and try to blow other people, because the world is getting, you might say, smaller and smaller, shrinking. And they're leading up with people who have different values, particularly values in regard to women and women's freedom and women's rights. And the Islamic people are just terrified, hey, we can't tolerate these changes, so they're determined they're going to stop the make sure that those changes never happen here. And it's a tough time. I mean, when things start changing, I mean, it's tough. And we're having changes in our own country. And it's a very tough time when old ways want to die hard. Well, the Chinese went through this also. Anyway, oh yes, now as for China, the history of China revolves around its dynasties. After the fall of the Han, we talked about the Han dynasty in chapter 5, you had what's called the era of 6 dynasties. This is the only time in China's history when China was not united. When the Han Dynasty fell, now the Han Dynasty fell about the time the Roman Empire was falling, and a lot of the reason the Han Dynasty fell was barbaric, uncivilized people from here in Mongolia were coming in and creeping in, and they were being forced down south by a climate cooling. And I can't say enough. One of the things we look for, when the climate cools, people begin starving, animals begin starving, plants begin dying out. So these Mongolians were forced on the move, and they eventually destroyed the Han, but did not completely destroy Chinese civilization. And right after that, the Chinese were disunited for a few hundred years. Then the Chinese became united again. The two dynasties you want to remember were the Tang and the Song. Now, your book gives a pronunciation of both of these words. I'll just call them Tang and Song. If you know about pronunciation, I'll be glad to hear from you. Anyway, under the Tang dynasty, China expanded its borders. China was united. China conquered Tibet. China had a very, very powerful army. The Tang dynasty coincides in Europe with what Europe's called the High Middle Ages. And folks, this era of the High Middle Ages were as hot as a firecracker, hotter than the climate was probably hotter than it is now, even though we don't have accurate thermometers to determine that. This was a time of expansion. Then, as was the case of all dynasties, the Tang dynasty gave way to the Song dynasty. The Song dynasty was a socialistic dynasty. They did a lot to help the poor, and both this may sound noble, but I can't say enough, and I don't know how much I've said this class. It is not up to the government to help the poor. When governments start helping the poor, the government collapses. And the Song was no exception. Under the Song, China had made progress in the fields of art and music, but they were militarily weak. We have a lot of people. They lost Tibet, and then the unthinkable happened. These uncivilized barbarians, the Mongolians from up here, led by Genghis Khan, did he erase? No, his name's still there. Led by Genghis Khan, came in. Genghis Khan had no more than 100,000 men. The Chinese had millions of people, maybe 30 or 40 million. Genghis Khan conquered them because his warriors were ruthless. They would swoop down. Now, folks, I strongly believe that if the Chinese had trained their army, they could have trained 300,000 to 400,000 of their best soldiers and gotten about 300,000 or 400,000 of their best horses. And I strongly believe that they would have stopped Genghis Khan. Now, I had a student argue that. I mean, I can't prove it. You can argue if you want to. This man said, oh, Genghis Khan was a super great military. No, Genghis Khan was only human. He took advantage of the weakness of China's army and of the fact that the Chinese wouldn't fight. They knew they were licked before they started. They couldn't stand up to these terrible, ruthless, semi-demonic invaders. And they were partially conquered. They wound up being completely conquered under Genghis Khan's sons and grandson. Genghis Khan's grandson was Kublai Khan. The Song dynasty that gave way to the Mongol dynasty, the Yuan. That's it. Y-U-A-N. That was the Mongol dynasty. The biggest, most important ruler of the Mongol dynasty was Kublai Khan. Kublai Khan is remembered by Westerners because while Kublai Khan was emperor, Marco Polo left Italy and his family, and they traveled to the court of the Great Khan. And when Marco Polo returned, he wrote a book about his travels and got Europeans interested in China. And Europeans thought, hey, this great, great country of China. Well, and it made Europeans interested in trying to get to China, and eventually led to Christopher Columbus telling everybody, hey, but the reason Europeans could not easily go to China was between Europe and China lay the Muslim world here. So Christopher Columbus thought, well, if we could go around the Muslim world, the Portuguese wound up going around the Muslim world by going around Africa. The Spanish tried to go around the Muslim world by going straight west, but they bumped into North and South America, and they kept the Spanish away from the Far East for a while. But eventually the Spanish learned they could either go around South America or go around Africa here and reach the Far East, and Spain was destined to conquer the Philippines. So Spain made its presence felt in the Far East. But Marco Polo was the Italian explorer, Marco Polo, who got Marco Polo got Europeans interested in China. Europeans had known a little bit about China down through the ages and thought of China as being a land of wizardry and magic. All right. Japan. Know what the 4 Japanese islands are. Let's see if I can remember them here. Yeah, okay. All right. Japan is a country sitting on the top of volcanic mountains. Essentially, Japan was made, like the Hawaiian Islands were, by volcanoes kept shooting up until eventually the volcanic ash rose up above the level of the sea. Then the volcanic ash kept rising and formed these 4 islands. And these 4 islands were eventually settled by humans. Now, also, very important, one reason Japan has so many volcanoes, the Earth sits on tectonic plates. And where these tectonic plates come together is called a fault line. And every once in a while, these fault lines will move. And when they move, this creates earthquakes and tidal waves. Throughout its history, Japan has been subject to some very, very severe earthquakes and extremely severe tidal waves. The most recent one occurred only about 5 years ago in 2011, when a massive earthquake hit Japan and sent a tidal wave that spread out over the land and carried away thousands of people, and also the salt water got into some of the nuclear reactors and turned the area into a radioactive area that's going to be radioactive for maybe 100 or more years, maybe 200 or 300 years, to where the cattle that grows there cannot be eaten because they're partially radioactive, and to where that the grassland cannot be grazed on because it's partially radioactive. This occurred just a mere 5 years ago, I believe in March 2011. So they've had numerous earthquakes down through their history. The earthquakes are severe, but the Japanese people persevere. And every time there's an earthquake, the Japanese will come in and rebuild, and just like they did in 2011. Japan is the one country in the world that has had the same dynasty for about 2,600 years. The same ruling dynasty. The reason for that is that their very religion is Shintoism. The emperor is looked on as being divine. The Japanese will claim that their emperors came down from heaven. And but however, we have not done a real DNA study of the emperors, as far as I know, or as a member of the royal family. But we suspect that the emperors actually probably came from here in Korea, took over Japan around 2600 or so, long before the Japanese islands were even settled, and claimed themselves to be divine. So they have ruled Japan. Japan still, to this day, keeps time the way the ancients used to, according to the rule of their emperor. So now the present emperor took over in 1989, so this is like the year 28 of the present emperor. Now the previous emperor ruled for more than 50 years. That was Emperor Hirohito, and he was the emperor during World War II. And when Japan lost, we allowed him to remain in office. The emperors keep themselves in isolation, and only after the 2011 earthquake did a Japanese emperor finally appear on television. Before that time, the Japanese emperor said, no, we're too sacred to appear on TV, but finally the Japanese emperor allowed himself to appear on TV. Most of the emperors have been mere figureheads. So when Japan decides to change governments, they'll leave the emperor alone, but they'll change prime ministers, but while the emperor is a figurehead. And the history of Japan has been a history of a pendulum-like swing between centralization on the one hand or localization on the other. When the central government comes too corrupt, the people will favor the local government. When the local government seems to not meet their needs, they'll go back to a central government. Central, local, central, and during all this time when the Japanese are going back and forth from one type of government to another, the emperors remain the emperors, aloof from all this and seemingly above all this strife. Had a niece was assigned a paper one time to do a paper on the religion of Japan. She said she was having a hard time about it, and here's why. Of all the peoples of the earth, it seemed like the Japanese are the least interested in religion. That's been true a long time. But what does Shinto believe? Well, they like the British, they like the tea ceremony. They like to beautify their buildings, their dwelling place with flowers. Tea ceremony, flowers, they look on the emperor as being divine, even though today most Japanese people will tell you they do not believe that, but they look on the emperor as being divine, so they believe that they should have total loyalty to the state. This became especially true during World War II. They were totally, and this put them, during World War II, put them on the same side as Italy and Germany, because both Italy and Germany believed that everybody should be supremely loyal to the state and do what the state told you to do, no matter what the state told you to do. So this meant that Japan and Italy and Germany were able to unite, but when the war actually broke out, Italy and Germany did practically nothing to help Japan, and Japan did practically nothing to help Italy and Germany. It was like they were on the opposite side from the United States, but they were fighting individual wars without coordinated effort, whereas the Allies, the Americans and British and Soviets got together and formed a united, coherent front, while the enemy was fighting as individual countries without this coherence, without getting together to announce to each other what they were going to do. That's why when Japan invaded Pearl Harbor in 1941, Hitler should have told Japan, now wait a minute, you did not tell me you were going to invade, I did not authorize, I did not approve this, so therefore I'm not going to help you. Instead, Hitler declared war on the United States because the United States declared war on Japan. And the rest is history. Hitler lost. Hitler should have told the Japanese, well, hey. And also, when Mussolini invaded Greece, Hitler should have told us, hey, I did not authorize this. Instead, Hitler came to Mussolini's aid, and it contributed to Hitler eventually losing. But these people would make their moves, the enemy, without letting their buddies know what they were doing, and the result was a loss for them. Whereas the United States even tried to trust Stalin, the United States, Britain, and Soviet Union. So that was one of the things that contributed to the loss. Now, Japan was never conquered until the United, in fact, Japan never lost the war. The United States broke in 1945. But Kublai Khan sent a fleet to conquer Japan, and Kublai Khan's fleet was met by a divine wind, and this destroyed Kublai Khan's fleet. There was a big gale came up, a big storm came up, and Kublai Khan's fleet was sunk by the tall waves or dashed against. This they called a divine wind, or kamikaze. We're going to see this word kamikaze again. Anybody know where? During World War II, Japanese suicide fighters were called kamikaze. The kamikaze, the suicide fighters that the Japanese used in World War II when they were losing. They decided to send a bunch of airplanes loaded with explosives to ram American shipping. It was not effective, it turned out, but it's what the Japanese did as a last resort. There were two reasons. Number one, that they did not know that these planes, once loaded with explosives, were hard to steer because they were heavy, but nobody ever returned to tell them that. And number two, the pilots who flew them were highly drugged and highly drunk and could not fly in a straight line straight toward a target. And the result was most of these kamikaze planes landed harmless in the ocean. But it terrified American sailors who had to shoot. But these planes, unlike other airplanes of sober pilots who, when the fire got too hot, they turn around and run. These people just keep right on coming and coming, coming. And eventually, and a lot of them were hit by bullets and their planes blew up in the air. A lot of them missed their targets and sunk in the ocean. A few of them actually hit their targets, but they did not do much damage. The kamikaze is the same word that the Japanese used to describe the divine wind that came their way when Kublai Khan tried to invade them. It was like a gift from the gods. Oh yes, something else I must mention about Japan. They have a type of poetry, linked verse called haiku. The reason I remember it is when I was in high school, I was asked to write a haiku poem. I failed the attempt. I could not write a haiku poem. But essentially, it's linked verse that consists of 3 lines. The 3 lines, I think, consist of something like 5 syllables on the first one, 7 on the second one, and 6 on the. Now, if I'm wrong, you can correct me. But there's so many syllables on the line 1, on line 2. But also, the haiku poem was tended. The first 2 lines like take you in one direction. Then the 3rd line jerks you off in another direction. Many of you know what I'm talking about. Do you ever run into haiku poetry? Okay, one of you has, the other ones. But anyway, a linked verse called haiku poem. Mine. Oh yes, Japan. Believe it or not, this volcanic ash, I'm talking Japan farming, volcanic ash makes really good soil. But the problem the Japanese have with farming is the mountains are often very steep. These volcanic mountains are form steep sides, and that makes farming a little bit difficult. So much of Japan cannot be farmed. Now, in modern times, Japan has a cattle industry, but very, very little. But they want to make sure that their own people eat their cattle. So I've heard that the people of Japan will buy beef at a cost of something like $20 a pound, because that's how much it costs for a Japanese cattleman to raise his cows, or his cattle. It's expensive, and the United States could easily put beef on a table with much, much less, but they keep our beef out by a high tariff, a very high tax on imported beef to make sure that people eat their own beef at a much, much higher price. But again, Japan is not a great place to raise beef cattle, not a great place for farming, owing to the extremely steep hills, and even in a valley between 2 mountains, the sun doesn't shine on the crops enough to give them a lot of sunshine that the crops need. One of the main crops is rice. Like in China, this part of the world right here, they grow a lot of rice. Well, Vietnam and China and Korea and Japan, they grow a lot of rice. And also, when they're growing their rice, you may know that rice requires that it be kept underwater for a while. So they'll double up on the rice by putting koi fish in their rice paddies. And that way, come harvest time, they'll harvest koi fish along with rice. And you know what a koi is. Yeah, I have some of my fish pond at home, but unfortunately, I haven't been able to grow mine very well. They'll get about 6 or 8 inches long, and then somehow they die on me. I don't know what's wrong with it. I have a lot of goldfish, but koi I just haven't done well with. But koi can be raised in fish ponds. Anyway, they'll now. Oh yes. The Japanese, talking about Japanese religions, the Japanese have a creation myth that says that a god and goddess united and this formed the universe. Again, oh, I thought my computer was getting a bit dim. Now I know why. That helped. Now, a lot of people have believed this about creation, that a god and goddess married and their offspring became the universe. The difference, though, with Japan is like the only highly advanced culture that had a creation myth that's usually believed by primitive people. Let's face it, there are some religions that are only seemingly worshipped by primitive people. In this part of the world, and here in North America, you had animism as its original, the original habits practiced animism. Most of you people who practice animism, shamanism, remain primitive. That's why these people, when they became civilized, tended to adopt Buddhism, because they realized Buddhism was a religion of the more advanced people, more so than animism. But the Japanese creation myth, normally associated with primitive people, in this case, the Japanese managed to become fairly powerful and still believe it. All right. Korea. All right. The one thing you want to remember about Korea, throughout most of their history, they have been divided. And today that is still true. Today Korea makes the news because Korea is still divided, and North Korea seems to be defying the whole world. But Korea is still a divided country. But anyway, throughout much of history, Korea is located right here between Japan and China. And throughout much of their history, the Japanese have tried to get them. The Chinese have tried to get them. So the Koreans have isolated themselves. They call themselves, and they've been called the Hermit Kingdom because the people living here do not want to have anything to do with other peoples. Racially, the Koreans seem to be somewhat unique in that we cannot tell where they originally came from. Now they are human. They do have the mitochondrial Eve in their DNA, and they do have the Y chromosome that indicates they were descended from Adam. But otherwise, we cannot tell. As most historians think they probably came from Mongolia, but they have things about it that are not some of the Mongolians. So they're difficult to tell where their original home was, where they might have come from before they arrived in Korea. They adopted a lot of Japanese ways, including the civil service exam. And in religion, they went from their own religion, which was a primitive form of animism, but eventually they adopted Buddhism. Now today, I'm going to fast forward to 2016. The most Christian country in the world is South Korea. But South Korea is half Buddhist. The other half is Christian. The world's largest Christian churches are in South Korea. So a lot of the South Koreans converted to Christianity after the Korean War. The Korean War, which occurred a few years after World War II. In the North, they outlawed most religions, so they claim to be all communist. But what we know about a lot of the people, they still cling to Buddhism, the ones who have any religion at all. Mostly cling to Buddhism.
What's Russia religion?
Russia?
Yeah, what's this?
Throughout most of the history, since they, originally the Russians seem to be descended from these Vikings here, and they worshipped Thor and Odin and Frigga and Tyr, the Norse gods. Then they converted to Christianity, but they became Eastern Orthodox Catholic, as opposed to Roman Catholic. They never adopted Roman Catholicism, they adopted Eastern Orthodoxy, and they remained Eastern Orthodox until the communists took over in 1917. Then when the communists declined in the 1990s, Eastern Orthodoxy tried to revive. But today, the ones of them who have any religion, in this area here of Russia, there's a whole lot of Islamic people. Islam, a whole lot of Islam. In this area, the people that are Christian are still mostly Eastern Orthodox Christian.
But the country itself, what's like, you know how each country has its, like, it's American, like the United States is Christian. The Middle
Eastern
East-
Orthodox Christian, primarily Eastern Orthodox.
That's the general.
The thing about the communism, only 2% of the Russians ever really converted to communism, but they had this hold. Again, because the Russian mentality, you might say the Russian psyche, which says obey your authority no matter what. So they had the 2% that took over had this hold on the Russian people. But a lot of Russians remained strong religious even throughout the communist era. And I'll tell you, I have heard that the Russian people have more freedom of religion there than we do here in the States. Political correctness has greatly curtailed a lot of our freedom of religious expression to where we can't even put Christmas decorations in public places anymore, and can't even post the Ten Commandments in public places, and can't recite Christian prayers in the public schools. The Russians have no such stipulations. They actually allow their teachers, one I understand, or they actually allow their teachers to have students recite the Lord's Prayer in the public schools. More religious freedom and more religious tolerance than we have. In spite of the fact that it's been 70 years under communism. And Vladimir Putin is known to have once been a KGB agent. He was a strong communist, and in fact he was like head of the KGB. But he has more tolerance for religion than we do here in the States. Good question, though, and something else about the Russians' personal morality. Right after the communists took over in 1917, Lenin said that all sexual restraints were to be done away with. The Russian people were to have free access to each other, no matter what. Well, so what happened? Their women became psychotic, neurotic, emotional wrecks. Their men became irresponsible, deadbeat dads, and their children became incorrigible. Lenin only lasted 5 years, and Stalin took over. And Stalin reverted back to Christian morality. He outlawed adultery. He said all deadbeat dads must pay up, support the children up forth, or be jailed. He outlawed pornography, outlawed abortion. These laws are still strictly enforced. To where today in Russia, adultery is outlawed, pornography is outlawed, abortion is outlawed. You can decide for yourself whether that's good or bad. In the short run, the Soviet Union is like behind the United States, but right now we're in another face-off. The Soviet Union is we're in a face-to-face confrontation with Russia, and the Russians still greatly outnumber us. And at one time, our weaponry was better, but the Russians have improved. I have to tell you, I don't know if we're going to have that confrontation these days. 30 years ago, I mean, it was obviously the United States. Our weaponry was better. But they have improved. They've hired better scientists. They've trained their people better.
What's their status to the war? Like, are they more active, neutral? Like, do they have some, like support some countries?
Their status is they're trying to reconquer the territory they lost in the 1990s when they split up.
So they're like,
So they're starting out. They've carried along they carried a long war against Shinnika, and they carried a war against Afghanistan. It really hurt them. But they're now trying to get back the Ukraine, which Khrushchev gave to. They're trying to get back the Crimea, which Khrushchev gave to Ukraine. They're trying to get back to Crimea, and the rest of the world has opposed it. But I'm not going to say they won't get it back, because the people living there want to become part of Russia, don't want to become part of the Ukraine.
so they're still active.
They're still poised to fight.
Yeah,
They're still poised to fight.
like to stop by.
And they are still, they sent troops into Syria to help support Assad to fight ISIS. Then they withdrew the troops, but they can always send them back. Basically, they're still poised to fight. And also, the economic sanctions are going to set them back economically. And all right, I want to tell you something. It is known that economically deprived people make better fighters than well-fed, civilized, soft people. The Great Depression of the 30s got the United States ready for World War II. The troops that fought in World War II had gone through the Great Depression. You might be aware of that. Well, these people were so good at being deprived. They learned to do with what they have. I grew up in poverty, so we learned to play games with what we had, what we find around the house. We learned to make things. Deprived people wind up making better soldiers than well-fed, which is why we find the uncivilized win. But like I say, they, in some ways, their moral standards are higher than the moral standards of the West. And yes, while I'm on the subject of family, homosexuality is outlawed in Russia, like it is in the Islamic world. All right, we're going to move on. Oh yes, Vietnam. Essentially, if they want to remember about Vietnam, the Chinese came to Vietnam several times throughout their history, and that's why when we were fighting in the war of Vietnam, the Chinese sent some help to Vietnam, even though they didn't actually send troops. But Vietnam was conquered by China. And the Vietnamese people then were, the Chinese tried to make the Vietnamese like them, and to some extent did. The Vietnamese were tropical people, and let's face it, folk, I've had more than one person say they agree with it. Tropical people tend to be more primitive than people living in temperate regions. The Vietnamese were tropical people, jungle people. Anyway, the Vietnamese eventually resisted the Chinese and drove them out. When the Mongolians conquered China, the Mongolians came down to Vietnam, but again, the Mongolians fought like the Muslims did. The Mongolians were no match for the Vietnamese jungle fighters. The Vietnamese resorted to guerrilla warfare, and they drove these fierce Mongolian horsemen out. And again, they were destined to do the same thing against the United States many generations later. The Vietnamese know how to handle their jungles. Outsiders generally have not. It took Vietnam 1,000 years to finally throw off China. And again, part of that was these people tended to be tribal and primitive. They did not embrace Buddhism as much as these other peoples of Southeast Asia, owing to the fact that the strong influence of China meant a lot of them became Confucian. But when the United States went to Vietnam, we had the problem with Buddhist monks, and Buddhist monks would put gasoline on themselves and set themselves on fire in protest. And this did a lot to hurt the American cause in Vietnam. So Buddhism was strong, so was Confucianism. Buddhism, Confucianism, and the Roman Catholic Church did a lot to send its missionaries into Vietnam, but they did not westernize Vietnam. In fact, the problem is, when the United States went to Vietnam, we never did succeed in westernizing these people. They have their own type of climate, and that climate influences their culture. Their climate is a hot climate. Their culture revolves around the jungle, and the jungle means that these people tend to become loosely affiliated with tribal peoples that don't easily unite and are not easily conquered either. And they have eventually managed to kick the foreigners out. Throughout much of their history, like Korea, they were disunited. Today, they are united again. Unlike Korea, they are united. And they adopted the Chinese civil service exam. Unlike other peoples, though, the Korean women are given more freedom than the women in other parts of this part of the world. Now, Japan would give its women more freedom in time of peace, and then when war broke out, they would restrict the women again. The Chinese have long restricted the women, and also, I must mention, the Chinese women practice what's called foot binding. The idea was to make from the time they were about 1 year old, put a really tight shoe on the foot so that their feet could not grow. And that way they would become crippled, but that way it made them subservient men. It also supposedly made them more attractive to men. Now, I had an American boy say, I don't find a crippled woman attractive. I said, no, you don't, you're not the Chinese. The Chinese for 1,000 years did find a crippled woman attractive. It changed the shape of their legs. That supposedly made them look better to the Chinese men. And this is as plain as I want to get quoted. It made them look better during the sex act. That's as much as I want to say about that. Anyway, the practice of foot binding was finally outlawed when the communists took over. Your authors will say that when they visited China in the 1980s, they saw some women who were still around who had their feet bound. But foot binding has since been outlawed in China. Okay, now I'm out of time, folks. What I've done, if you haven't guessed.